The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the first day of this beginning of a set of unique sessins, I think. Our April COVID-19 session here at Mountain Gate in April 2020, in the midst of the pandemic. And so things have been adjusted. The schedule's been adjusted because we're not doing morning chanting. It's been advised not to do so, nor will we do the evening chanting either. And so we're starting half an hour later, and we're also ending about half an hour early as well, to give people a chance to do extra rest if needed. But of course, there's also the recommendation that if your body is ready for it and it feels like it can make a difference for you, and you have to be careful about whether you're really discerning this or it's just a little bit of a self-image ploy to get a little extra sleep. Sometimes going beyond can make a big difference. And that's actually what we're all called upon to do now. We can't do things the old way. We can't go outdoors and do the kinds of things that we ordinarily would do, get together with friends, the whole cherry blossom viewing event in Washington, D.C., and also in Japan, where it's especially important and big, have had to be terrifically restricted. Our lives have been considerably restricted. And then we have another kind of funky restriction, which we experienced a short while ago here, right on the Zoom. And that is because there are so many people in the whole world using Wi-Fi, using the internet, that there are periodic interruptions because the capacity apparently isn't there to support every single human being. Streaming movies, the kids going to school from kindergarten on upward through college and grad school, and everybody visiting with friends and families, Zooming. I got an email from an old high school classmate who mentioned that he's doing Zoom cocktail hour with his daughter who lives in a different area. Zoom must be going incredibly well. I think that for the moment, it might be wise to invest in Zoom if it is on the public market. But that would only be temporary, as things are. And we just had noticed that there was a slight internet connection. I hope you didn't see much of a gap. This will happen periodically. Among other things, we are remote, but we do have internet by way of fiber optic cable, although it's been a little bit more dicey since the fire the other day, which burned through both electrical and fiber optic cables next door extensively. And I don't know whether it's that the splice was challenged or whether it's just this simply there's so much traffic that this is how it is. I started practicing in 1974. I could have been in Jurassic Park alone, being pursued by human-eating dinosaurs, fleeing for my life. That's how it felt. It took that to get me to practice, actually. 3 months before that, somebody had offered to teach me Zen meditation, and I said, nah, no thanks. But then everything fell apart. There was nothing I could hold on to. I lost everything that meant anything to me. And so I started doing Zen practice because I realized that the only relief from that extreme suffering was to go inward and to let go where I was being caught and therefore suffering. And we're all actually being called upon to do that now too. Well, we're always being called upon to do that, but it seems that with the extremity of the world situation, we're not only faced with the death situation. They're now saying that death from COVID-19 is surpassing all other means of death, or I don't know whether you call it means of death, but I guess that's it. More than heart attacks, more than strokes, more than accidents, more than suicides, more than any other way that people die. Apparently, more people are dying through this coronavirus than any other way. And then the effect it's having on the economy is now spoken of as being equivalent to the Great Depression worldwide. I saw a headline that yesterday 100 million people in the United States applied for the benefits from being out of work. And then there's the untold pain of not being able to be with your loved ones, or if you are with your loved ones, how limited you are in being able to connect with them physically. There's a lot of walls being built around us, and the walls are closing in, it feels like. So by 1975, I realized that I needed to have something more than just my own solitary practice in Istanbul, where I was living at the time. And so I connected with the Rochester Zen Center. And my first sesshin was in 1975. And then the second one was in 1976. Second one was later that year, and I moved to Rochester at that point because I realized that I needed to have some outside pressure to sit. I had enough internal recognition that there was no way out of this pain that I was suffering from than to sit. But sitting and me were like two magnets. If you face them in the wrong direction, they cannot meet. They push away from each other. And it's like me and my mat were those two magnets. So I realized I had to go someplace where I would be forced to sit, that if I didn't sit, I wouldn't be able to live there. And so I went to try to live at the Rochester Zen Center. And after 8 months, I was invited to join the staff. That meant moving into the Rochester Zen Center, practicing daily, which I already was doing, but I was living outside the Zen Center, walking down a couple of blocks twice a day, 4 times a day, down and back, to go to the sittings. And I noticed that it's almost as if the water was rising. That was my sense of metaphor, that the water was rising and it was gradually coming up to my chin, and I would stretch and I would reach higher and it come almost to my nose, and I get up on my tippy toes and it was still rising. And at the time, I still owned a house in the Washington, D.C. area, which wasn't that far away. And so I asked if I could leave for the weekend and go down there. And somehow, something always interfered every single time. Either there was a ceremony scheduled or some other event. There was some reason each time why I was not going to be able to go down there and escape. And it began to be actually comical. in a sense, I was trapped. I was trapped between my dragons, my dinosaurs, and the pain and resistance to letting go. Eventually, enough zazen, enough sesshin, enough psychotherapy, and the ongoing recognition that there was no way out other than going straight forward in the direction I was going. That there was nothing, not cocktails with my family, which we didn't actually do anyway. We weren't really drinkers. Not any of the ways that people avoid, people run away from, people entertain themselves to not see or not hear or not feel. I wasn't interested in that. I knew that it was only temporary, whatever I would try, and there was no alternative but to go inward. But as you've already heard, it was not easy. Nowadays, we are faced with a tremendous opportunity because we've got the whole world that is narrowing down our options. And like Jacques Lasserre in Buchenwald, whose options were severely narrowed, they were ritually starved in that prison camp. They were murdered by all kinds of different means. It was hellish, more than hellish. Talk about dinosaurs chasing you. And finally, he couldn't take it anymore, and he became mortally ill. And there were 3 doctors in the camp who were also prisoners like himself who diagnosed him, and he was dying. They carried him away to die, to a piece of concrete somewhere outside where at least he wouldn't be in the midst of the enormous throngs of people that lived in that one narrow, small barracks for people who were not considered worthy of living by the Nazis. And faced with being up against those walls, and the walls are all inner, he broke free and found joy. And it wasn't the joy of insanity, it was the joy of freedom. The only real freedom there is, the freedom to be free in the midst of the most incredible constraints or suffering. Because that is inborn in us. We each have the capacity to reach that, but it's not reached easily. We have built high walls around ourselves to prevent ourselves from reaching it, because it feels so frightening to stray from this tiny, narrow, but seemingly protective self-image. Recently, I think it was yesterday in the news, the various different news, there was an interview with a young man, 26 years old at this point, who had been in the Boston Marathon when it was bombed. And in fact, he was arriving at the finish line just when the bombs went off. And what he says is that he wasn't outwardly injured. His injury was inside. He got PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and went all over the world running, and one might say in an attempt to avoid his man-eating dinosaurs. But he was trying to find some level of peace. And in the end, he did. He actually ran in Antarctica. It talks about him having to dodge penguins running. He ran on every single one of the 7 continents in the world. And after ultramarathons and marathons, he finally reached a point where he felt that what had happened to him was actually a blessing. And I hope that each one of you will look back on this time of extreme challenge for most people and realize it is a blessing, and to recognize that blessing by transforming in your own life, letting go the self-image, letting go the felt needs, letting go the fear of letting go, because that's a big one. That's a really big one. And that's really what keeps us trapped. We have developed through our childhood experiences and our adult experiences a sense of self. I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. And it becomes familiar. It's like an enormous security blanket. It's like a haven. And it gets insulted, and it gets angry, and it gets all kinds of mind states that are uncomfortable, but we cling tenaciously to that assumption, and it is an assumption, of who we are. Who are we really? Who are we really? I sent an email message out to most of you quite a while ago when things first began to hit the fan, and spoke of a young tulku, Tibetan tulku. A tulku is a person who is recognized as a reincarnation of someone who had been a spiritual leader in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition in a past life. And he decided when he was, I think he was 36 when he decided this, that he would go on a pilgrimage all by himself. He had never really been alone in his life because he was recognized very early on as a tulku. And his father was an extremely highly regarded tulku who's now dead, long dead actually, and highly respected, and was his first teacher. But by the time he was 9 years old, he was getting Buddhist monk training, and was quite closely protected because of that. And he talks about going off and doing what he thought was sitting, or felt sort of imitated sitting in caves up in the mountains behind his house in Nepal. And when he would come back down again, his grandmother was pretty upset because he had disappeared. Where was he? Was he lost? Was something happened to him? And so on and so forth. And he tells one story about a time when some sort of special document was needed. He was going to China or something. And so his mother and a monk who was his, I don't know what you call it, attendant, I guess, an older man who was his attendant, took him along to a government office in a different town. And his attendant settled him in a restaurant, ordered food for him, and told him to stay put until they returned. And so then he and the attendant and his mom went off to the government office. He ate his food, and then he got bored. And so he headed over to the government office to find his mother and the attendant. And when he did find them, they were both upset that he had left the restaurant alone. And he adds, but I wasn't 7 years old. I was 17. So for him to have the amazing experience of going off on his own, buying a train ticket on his own, which he'd never done before, and going off, and his plan was to do it for 44 or 5 years, to experience life as a wandering beggar and all the things that would come forth from that, all the experiences. And boy, right in the very beginning, he had experiences. But he also, when he finally got to a point where he was out of money, he had only been able to save a little bit of money that lasted only a short while. And then he was out of money. And so he had to beg for his food. And he was told to go to the back door of a restaurant at closing time, and they would give him food. So he did that for several days in a row, and then he got quite deathly ill, and death is the word. He began vomiting and having diarrhea, and got increasingly dehydrated and increasingly ill, to the point where he finally had no strength to go and lift the handle on the pump that would allow him to get water. He kind of woke up out of a sleep at one point, and somebody had placed a couple of bottles of water by his side, but he went through those pretty fast, and he kept getting weaker and weaker. And finally he realized that he probably would die. And he just entered into the experience of those moments as they unfolded. It wasn't without regret. He burst into tears at one point when he realized that he would not see his mother again and the rest of his family. He had several brothers, I think. And he accepted them, the situation, completely. And obviously, somebody rescued him. Otherwise, we wouldn't know this story. He woke up in a hospital. But the book is well worth reading because it talks not only about the challenges he met, but also how he felt and what he did with regard to dealing with that. It's a wonderful book of practice, really. His name.
We just need to press record.
What do we need to do?
Oh, it's still recording.
There's John, I think.
Yeah.
There we are. Okay. I hope everybody's still back connected. At any rate, the man's name is Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche. Oh, here we go again. And there are a number of books, and also you can log on to his website, Tergar International, I think it's called. And he's got some excellent teachings on practice. He's a Dzogchen teacher, and Dzogchen is the Tibetan Buddhist form of practice that is most like Zen practice, and they do breath practice. And he's quite an excellent teacher. But I'm a little bit aside from the point. This young man who did the marathon all over the world as a result of trying to avoid his man-eating dinosaurs, said finally that it was actually a gift. And I printed out some of this article. His name was Bobby O'Donnell. He was nearing the finish line of the 2013 Boston Marathon, where his family was gathered to cheer for him when terrorist bombs killed 3 spectators and injured more than 260 others. And if you saw the aftermath of that, it was pretty gory. His family escaped unscathed, not O'Donnell, whose wounds were invisible and scarred his soul. My injury, he says, was in my head. It took years for O'Donnell to realize he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. At now 26, he's the author of Running Wild, a newly released memoir of completing marathons or ultra marathons on all 7 continents, dodging penguins on Antarctica, and bounding along the slopes of Mount Everest in a quest for inner healing and to rediscover the joy of running. And what else does it say? Somewhere he talks about he's being interviewed here. And he says, I think people might be able to find this. Here we are. At one point in the book, you talk about how it dawned on you that maybe the bombing, in a weird way, was a blessing in your life. O'Donnell says, I think people might be able to find this out of COVID. The Boston Marathon bombing undoubtedly was the worst day of my life. But if it didn't happen, none of anything in the book would have occurred. I would have never traveled, never experienced the world the way I did. It took having this terrible thing happen to me to have all the wonderful things that followed occur. When I face a tragedy or adversity, what I've come to realize is I need to decide where I want this to go from here. And that is our wonderful potential here as well. We need to decide where we want to go from here. And we can open to the amazing amount of freedom we have built in if we let go of the self-image. Not easy, but worth it. And each one of you is courageous, and that's all it takes. Courageous and maybe a few dinosaurs chasing you down. Another Tibetan master, Longchenpa, who lived in the 9th or 10th century, somewhere way, way back, actually had discovered, as some of you have already heard, what Peter Levine and other psychotherapists, and including the gentleman who wrote the focusing book, that there's a way to work with our feelings that releases them and frees us from them. And here is Longchenpa's teaching. And if anybody would like to have a copy of this, please let me know, and I'm happy to print it out. And, well, I could just email it to you. You can print it out. Though attachment, aversion, dullness, pride, and envy may arise, and that goes for any feeling. You could say, though anger, irritation, annoyance, frustration arise, fully understand their inner energy. Fully understand their inner energy. How do you do that? By tuning in. You can't do it by going, no, I don't want to feel this. You understand by tuning in. Tuning in means with your body, not with your head. Not developing a story about it, not analyzing it, but feeling the quality of the energy that is what we would call whatever that feeling is. Even if it's a kind of a no-name feeling, that's good enough too. Tune into your body. So, in other words, whatever arises, whatever difficult feeling arise, fully understand their energy, their inner energy. Recognize them in their very first moment before karma has been created. In other words, our habit patterns are to kind of knee-jerk a reaction. something irritates us or we get embarrassed, and we immediately try to put it on somebody else. Oh, it's their fault. Oh, it's the fault of World Health. They didn't let us know early enough about this virus thing, and so on and so forth. We have a lot of automatic reactions, and they're self-defenses. But where is the self that needs to be defended? It's only from the other side of that wall that you can realize how much of an illusion we were being captured by in assuming this persona, this self-image. Who we really are is so amazing and so potentially free to express the innate compassion and wisdom that we're born with, that everyone's born with, that so many people cover over in defense and out of pain and suffering. We can realize that. To continue. In the second moment, look nakedly at the state and relax in its presence. In other words, practice radical acceptance. You don't have to like the feeling, that's not required. But open to it, be curious about it. What does it really, really feel like in your body? Is there some kind of extra heat somewhere? Is there some kind of jagged energy somewhere? Is there tension? Go ahead, open to the full exploration. Now, this takes practice. It doesn't normally happen the first time you try it, at least not if you're as shut down as I was. But keep persisting, because it will make a big difference. It'll make an enormous difference in your life. Tune in. You know you've tuned in when the experience is rich and alive. You know that you're holding it at arm's length when there's a feeling of two-dimensionality about it, a flatness about it. Though attachment, aversion, dullness, pride, and envy may arise, fully understand their inner energy. Recognize them in the very first moment before karma has been accumulated. In the second moment, look nakedly at this state and relax in its presence. Then, whichever of the five passions, or any of the passions, arise becomes a pure presence, freed in its own place without having to eliminate it. It emerges as the pristine awareness that is pleasurable and not conditioned by thought. Not conditioned by thought. That's the secret. Human beings have not just the right nose, the left side of the brain, I guess it is. It is the part of our being that has developed to see patterns, including language. It allows language, actually. It allows that language to be understood, allows us to learn how to read, speak, and comprehend, and do all kinds of really interesting things, including create stories, write novels, analyze situations. It's a wonderful asset, but we take it for the ultimate principle. And there's another side of our brain that has a great sense of presence, that senses the meaning of things without the need for language. Actually, it can't even understand language, but is equally valuable and worth embracing. So who we think we are is not by any means the whole story. And right now, when things are so constrained and there is so much fear and there's so much anxiety and there are so many limitations, good heavens, you go to the grocery store and most of what you need to buy is not there, just empty shelves. And you're taking your life in at risk, just walking into the store, just going in among people, doesn't matter whether people have got masks on or not. We have in this valley a couple who were in Paris when the COVID-19 hit. And as soon as they realized that they better hightail it back to the States or they weren't going to be able to get a flight, they came back to the States. Now they were traveling with their daughter, who is a physician. And the daughter got sick with the virus. And she got tested and it was confirmed and she has recovered. So the parents, who are in their 70s, got tested as well. And for the last 3 weeks, a week apart, they have tested positive. There seems to be no end to it. They are asymptomatic, which is most curious, but they still somehow are still carrying the virus. So they have quarantined themselves and now they are at a point where they're wearing masks inside the house because they're not sure whether they're just passing it back and forth between them. There's a lot to be concerned about, but there's a lot to be free. Everything. We can be free from everything. And yet that does not interfere with our capacity to function in the world. In fact, it enhances our capacity to function in the world because we're not being narrowly driven by ideas of a self that has to be demanded respect for, or can't be embarrassed, or has to have certain people like them, and so on and so forth. That's not who we are. So find out, who are we? Because that's what will make you free. And we have the tools to do it with. The extended out breath filled with curiosity, beyond words. And if we're to step out of the left brain personator, then we need to go beyond words. And we can find our answers, and we will find our answers, and we will find our freedom beyond words. So I thank you for listening. We'll stop now. And I'll recite the 4 vows. The rest of you here in the Zendo can just do it silently. Shujo muhen segan no bono mujin segan dan Omon muryo segan gaku Butsuro mujo segan jo Shujo muhen segan do Mono mujin segan dan Omon muryo segan gaku Butsuro mujo segan jo Shujo muhen segan do Bono mujin segan dan Omo Butsuro Mujo Siganjo. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to liberate them. Clinging is inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to it. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to master them. The way of liberation is unsurpassable. I vow to become it. And now what time is it? We have about 16 minutes left for sitting. So let's go back to sitting. And then at 4:30, it'll be the end of the afternoon sitting. Thank you for listening. And keep going. I pray that each one of you will deeply realize the potential that you have to become truly free, so that no matter what happens, it won't be a problem, because there's nobody there to make it a problem. But at the same time, we naturally respond to the circumstance in the most optimal way without even trying to. We don't have to tell ourselves how to do it. That's built in. Uncover it increasingly. You can do it. So,